So when I start talking about the angriest admiral to ever live, most people think I'm referring to Admiral King of the US Navy. And honestly, he is a tough benchmark to beat because he had one temper and it was always a bad one. He was very even-tempered, it was just always bad. But he's probably not the angriest. No. Earl St Vincent, John Jervis. To call him a draconian disciplinarian would be to underrepresent things dramatically. To call him an absolutely nutty as a fruitcake when he's pissed off personality, yes. He was very professional, very energetic, expected everyone else to be exactly the same, and if you fell short of his standards, Lord help you. And that was the first thing. He would be angry at you not because you slighted him, not because you did anything necessarily wrong, but if you fell short of his standards of how he believed it should be done, or how he believed he himself would do it. He had this benchmark that as far as his view, he was perfection. Anything which was less than him, didn't work out, was therefore worthy of scorn. And anger. And a huge amount. He was basically angry 24/7, 52 weeks of the year, at everyone for not being as good as they could be. Honestly, if he was around these days, he'd probably be be a tech bro leading a massive tech corporation because you could see him fitting into that world dramatically. You could see him fit that kind of personality. You have to be perfect. Anything less than perfect is gone, it's ridden from my sight. Could seriously fit in with that. Jervis is he's a specialist in so many ways. But he's also a highly experienced naval officer, and despite all these things which should have made him an absolutely terrible person to work for some reason he's incredibly popular with his own crews. He's not popular with everyone else in the fleet. Everyone else in the fleet hates him. But the ships he's on love him. Potentially that's because once you achieve a level at which he's happy with you, therefore he then showers you with praise and you feel like you've really earned it, and at that point he's God because he's become your God just because the only way you're achieving it. I don't know. I'm not quite sure I believe in certain psychological phenomena they like to, bring out, like Stockholm Syndrome, etc. That the form of that seems to be pretty weak in some regards, and I do realise that some of that Stockholm Syndrome has been put down to certain very interesting things going on with the police forces at the time, and mild levels of corruption, but we'll leave that to one side. That's a completely different video. But there does seem to be something whereby the fleets, the things he's in charge of, after a while, they like this man, who's abusing them constantly. There is the possibility that he does, how do I put this another way, temper his forces into a finely honed blade. And you cannot argue that he does not produce, in the years of his service, when he's in command of them, or whether he's the first Sea Lord, fleets which were efficient, which had a high degree of professionalism, and whose officers were either good or gone. Because he wouldn't tolerate anyone. However, everything we've discussed with Rodney, he does to a lesser or greater extent as well. John Jervis is, as a leader, an incredibly complex figure to approach. Because almost everything he does as a leader goes against everything we have as rules for good leadership. You shouldn't have favorites. He has favorites. You shouldn't be holding people to impossible standards. He holds them to impossible standards. Everything you are taught in modern leadership and doctrine, which works quite well for dealing with people in master of time, he serves as the antithesis to. He is completely the opposite. And when he does stumble into something which would be considered good leadership, he doesn't necessarily like to keep it. He is a product of the patronage system. He's also a product of the, what I would call, the Total War faction in the Royal Navy. I really would call them the Total War faction in the Royal Navy. I can link them through history, and I've talked about factions in the Royal Navy, and that was the whole point of the Rodney video, was pretty much think about what factions, how, patronage still works, how patronage still works in all navies. Well, he's a product, Jervis is a product of the Total War, and for him, everything is about the Total War. One of the interesting things is when you follow factions through history, people often go, well, this person was part of this faction, this person must be part of this faction, and they're not. For starters, when I start talking about Jervis being a Total War, part of a Total War faction of the Royal Navy, and people go, well, I go, who other admirals you can think of who are part of it? They will usually bring up Fisher. Fisher is not. You see, the Total War faction of the Royal Navy are all about having the Total War capability. You don't accept any cuts in a Navy if you can avoid it. You have everything focused on producing that fighting fleet as efficiently as possible. And honestly, in the search of efficiencies, Jervis does cause problems. You see, the key word for him was efficiency, when the word should have been effectiveness. Because efficiency works as a goal when you can predict the usage of items, and you can predict their life cycle, so you can work out how to treat them. But warships, they might be going full speed for a storm. They might be piling on wind. They might be having to stay on station for weeks in calm weather and be fine, or they might have days of storms and have to return home for rigging to be fixed and all these things. You cannot necessarily predict, because the circumstances which dictate their operation are not efficiency of operation, but necessity of operation. So you have to run the support and the infrastructure based on effectiveness. By the way, one of the glorious things that happens with this faction is that they get a very bad reputation for ever being anywhere near in charge of things like the Navy Board and the infrastructure of the Navy after Jervis, because of their pursuit of efficiency versus effectiveness in terms of supporting, especially with him. Later on, they evolve. The faction evolves, and they start heavily leaning towards effectiveness rather than necessarily efficiency. And it's always a case-by-case basis, case-by-case scenario when you're dealing with governments or companies or all sorts of sections within a company or within a government, whether you should be looking for efficiency or effectiveness as your watchword. It's a judgment call. Okay? It's on the leaders to make that judgment call. But if you get it wrong, you set yourself up for failure. If you go for effectiveness, not efficiency, and efficiency is what you need, you're going to be costing yourself a lot more money than you need to be spending, which is going to be bad for the company in the long run. If you go for efficiency when effectiveness is what you need, then you're probably going to cause the company to have a major accident and break down, and if it loses enough reputation and has enough damage because of that, it could disappear. Both scenarios can have consequences. In companies, they can have dramatically worse consequences in governments. So, Jervis has a good early career. He really does. He starts off, and he's on decent-sized ships quite often. Now, he first ran away to join the Navy when he was 13 years old. He ran to Woolwich to join the Navy. But he returned home because he heard his family was upset at his disappearance. Friends of the family managed to, how do I put it, make the right connections. And with the help of Admiral George Townsend, he joins the Navy. He enters as technically an able seaman on HMS Gloucester, which was a sister of HMS Falkland, the plan of which is here. And she's a 50-gun ship. A 50-gun ship. Which is okay. It's not a bad position to be in. A 50-gun ship. It's a 4-freight. Now, service on 4-freights is always an interesting one because they become rare and rarer as ships in the Royal Navy over time, but they do seem to be the starting point for a lot of young officers who go on to become admirals. Rodney started off in 4-freights. 4-freights are these things which seem to be good experience tools for the Navy, and it's not necessarily surprising because they're a nice balance. They both have the size so that they're an realistically entry-level ship-of-the-line battle, because they have 2 decks. But they are small enough you can actually do some proper training. You can actually get some experience even as a junior officer or a able seaman, technically a boy midshipman. You can actually get some experience and learn from the captains and learn from the officers in this vessel. It's about the right size for it. And so he serves there. And when he's dealing with various Spanish guardacostas and privateers, he then from there serves there 1749 till roughly 54. He has fun. He goes through Gloucester. He then serves on a sloop called Ferret, then another 4-freight called Severn under Admiral Thomas Coates, and that's when he's raised to a midshipman. Then he's put on the Sphinx, 24-gun, technically post ship, technically 6-freight though, so never something the Royal Navy particularly really liked. They always liked something which had about 28 guns. That was what they really wanted, a lot of them. This in the period we're talking about, in the 1750s. Later on that goes up. They prefer the 32 guns, etc., and all those vessels, and they'll make up the most of the fleet. But at this point, 28 guns is fairly common. And he's doing well. He's doing well. Now, he has all sorts of events in his early career which do really affect him. One of them is drawing on his father's account with a local banker in Jamaica and finding that the money could not be paid. So he had to live as a common sailor until the money was paid off loan. And that was money he needed to support himself as a midshipman. Again, being in the Navy is expensive. There are differing rates of how much you're going to get supplied, and also until the money arrives, until things are confirmed, it can get very, very expensive. However, in 1755 he passes his lieutenant's exams, and he's assigned as 6th lieutenant to the Royal George, a 100-gun first-rate ship of the line. That's a good one. That gives him some experience. But then he moves to 3rd lieutenant on a 60-gun Nottingham. Back to those 4-freights. Back to a 4-freight. And whilst there, he serves with, the ship he's on serves in the fleet of Edward Boscan, which was preventing French reinforcements to reach New France, i.e. Canada. He then moves on to the 74-gun, 3rd rate HMS Devonshire, as as second lieutenant, and then is made fourth lieutenant on the 90-gun second-rate HMS Prince under Charles Saunders. Of course, goes on to quite a senior rank as well. So yeah, he's doing well. He's doing well. When Saunders is promoted to Admiral, Jervis is made a flag officer aboard the Culloden. And then again, a shining promotion. The whole way through, he's been a bit of a disciplinarian. But he's been an effective disciplinarian. When you've needed your ship brought in line, when you've wanted everything done, you bring him in. He will get your ship working very, very finely. In 1757, he's given temporary command of Experiment, HMS Experiment, when her captain is incapacitated by sickness. Now, this is where you get some interesting things, because when you are made captain of a ship, if you're not a captain in rank, but you're acting as a captain, you're given there's a different uniform you can be given to signify you're captain on that ship. When you're posted as a captain to a ship, i.e. it is posted on the Admiralty Arch and is posted in the London Gazette, then you are a post captain. Now, a post captain is not a special rank. It just means you're actually you're a captain who's a captain. You're not acting as a captain. Now, if you're a master and commander acting as a captain, you wear your rank as a commander. Master and commander, that's the rank you have. And you wear that. In other circumstances, there are differences of ranks going around. Now, I see all sorts of interesting things on the internet at some points about being post-captain after 3 years seniority. No. I see these things and I look at them and I go, well, that doesn't fit with any of the history that I can think of these officers. And we're talking about Jervis here. And the moment he gets to command a rated ship and it's posted, he's a post-captain. Before that, he was a commander. He had passed the lieutenant exam, but he was acting as a commander on ships that he was master and commander of. You know, he's promoted to commander and takes command of HMS Scorpion in 1759 after the taking of Quebec. He does all sorts of things. And that's what we're going to be talking about now. But the fact is, it's not 3 years or anything until he becomes post-captain after being captain. He was made a commander in 1760, and in October 1760, he's made a post-captain, or rather, he is made captain of HMS Gosport, which is a 44-gun, fifth-rate ship of the line, and therefore his captaincy, as he's been promoted to the rank of captain, is posted. Rather than free, he is literally, his first position as captain is captain of the Gosport, so he's a post-captain. There is no time waiting around it. He was literally a commander, made captain, and the whole thing comes about because, honestly, I think a lot of people read captain of a ship and presume their rank must be captain. And that, for a lot of the smaller ships, they don't need to. They could be lieutenants, they could be lieutenant commanders, they could be commanders. Lieutenant commander is something which comes in sort of later, but lead up one side. But how does he do this all so rapidly, quickly? You know, how does he, in the space of leaving Britain in February 1759, by October 1760, has made it to captain after having been a lieutenant for quite so long? And jumped around. Well, you know what? He does good in Quebec. He does really good in Quebec. That's the answer. Well, what he does is this. He's made, in May 1759, acting commander of HMS Porcupine. It's a sloop. And this is handled so well that the Admiral, when asked by Wolfe which ship should lead the preparations and then lead the armed transports past Quebec to land up the river, Wolfe and just a little-known guy called James Cook, quite famous for navigation reasons, discovers the route to Australia, these sorts of things, nothing too much, were aboard Jervis's ship to ensure the success of the mission. That's what gets him promoted to commander. And that, with the other admirals looking at him and going, hello, including Rodney, who was in charge of the Channel Squadron in 1760, is how, in October 1760, he gets made captain and put in charge of a rated ship, a post ship, and so his captaincy is posted. There's no 3 years waiting. I suppose there's a theoretical thing somewhere. If you're if you're promoted captain and spend 3 years on the beach, you might still get your rank posted somewhere, but usually you're not made captain until you can be given a command, so it's a theoretical without much of substance. Unless you're really not wanted by the Navy, in which case there are other things they'll do with you. And he does well in these roles. He does well with the Navy. He does well at this point. He's usually commanding fifth rates, and he's wandering around doing various operations as a fairly decent frigate captain. And he does that for a while. But where Jervis has always really stood out is when you're on large operations. When you are carrying out complicated maneuvers. If you want someone to go in and do a survey, he'll go in and do a survey. If you want someone to be a crucial part of a naval battle, you want Jervis. He is a very, very fine operator. As said, his methods of leadership are brutal. They are, even by standards of the time. He is draconian. When everyone else might say 10, you will get 100 lashes and will have the doctor say you've had enough at 20. He'll give you 500 lashes. And the doctor had better not interfere with his judgment. Unless your liver is literally showing. In which case, by the way, he will then have a word with the bosun's mate who was administering the justice about not doing that properly. And will probably give them an example on them of how they're supposed to do it. Because they must have administered it wrong for that to have reached that point. There are some fun stories about Jervis. There are some fun ones. But he is very much, and I cannot say this again, someone you call, if you want to make surveys and studies of harbours and coastlines, you send Jervis. You send Jervis. He actually does an inspection he does an inspection of St. Petersburg and other areas while he's in frigates. But the Battle of Ushant, well, he's in charge of HMS Kent. To begin with. She's a 74-gun ship. He's now in charge of a third rate. But she's found to be unfit for service. To be fair, the one who explains why she's unfit for service is he goes into the dockyard that was supposed to be surveying her and gets them to survey her again, and they find her unfit for service. So therefore, they put him in charge of the Foudroyant. This was a vessel he'd actually commanded back to Britain years earlier as its prize captain. So he knew it quite well. But that had been many years before, and the dockyard had done a lot of maintenance and work on the time. So she was different by this point. She was different. And Foudroyant's going to become his very special ship. She is going to be critical for his next operations and next battles, and for several years This is his ship. This is the ship which makes his name. This is the ship which secures him the promotion to an admiral, because this is a ship in which he really impresses things like people like Keppel, Augustus Keppel, as well as the other admirals he served with, and that is what allows him to get promoted. One of the things about the Total War faction is they often have to impress multiple admirals to get promoted, because they're always considered a bit of a loose cannon when it comes, because they go all out. They will produce great results, but they literally do not stop till the enemy's crushed. There is no half measures with the Total War faction. And by the way, you can still find this faction in the Royal Navy today. They're not as big or as dominant as they once were, but they're still there. There's still that line of patronage has continued. And so, the first Battle of Ushant and HMS Fudrundt, and what she gets up to. Now, in this battle, Fudrundt was the ship behind victory. So, Augustus Keppel and his senior at the team were aboard Victory, and Fudrundt is the ship behind him. So he is the one who can see most what Augustus Keppel is aiming and is suggesting for. The battle is a tough battle, but it's not as successful as everyone really wants it to be. In fact, it's 29 ships aligned versus 30, and it's indecisive is what we usually call it as. The British lose more killed than wounded, and therefore it should be on the French side. It should be the French victory, but to an extent the French stand away from the British despite chasing them, so you could argue the British won. But you could do without victories like that. Now, one of the interesting things is that after this battle, Keppel gets court-martialed. They're investigating him, seeing if he did all he could do. And it's Jervis who gives a stalwart defence. Jervis, on Fudrundt, knew exactly what was going on, was able to give a very stalwart defence. Far stronger than Campbell and Faulkner, who were aboard Keppel's position. Now, there is a really interesting discussion here, because we get into the whole thing of first captain or second captain, etc., on their ships. Faulkner's the captain of HMS Victory at this point. He is the flag captain. But Keppel is senior enough, as being a full admiral, he rates another senior officer to assist him with his administration duties, i.e. be his staff officer, and help him with running and coordinating the fleet. And that is John Campbell, who's a rear admiral. And sometimes people call him the first, they're called as first captain and second captain. That's not really a thing. You'd have the captain of the ship, and you'd have someone sometimes called, they might be called the flag captain, because they're the captain of the flagship. But you could also have someone who is the captain of the fleet. There are various titles which could go around and change. First and second captain, not really a thing in the British phraseology. That's more of a... Occasionally some of the European navies adopt it. And it's one of those things of, you see standardization applied to history so people can, draw parallels between them. And it's good because it allows people to compare, this officer's in this position and so they're doing similar roles. It's bad when we start to assume those are the positions in their fleets. Because again, they're not necessarily called those things, they do different things. There are two senior officers aboard Victory, only one of them is her captain. There are two senior officers aboard Victory, other than the Admiral, to assist the Admiral in his duties. Because it's a large enough fleet, we are talking 29 ships of the line, plus frigates. You basically need some actual staff officers. And so there is a staff officer. Now, after that Battle of Ushant, he's again doing patrol duties. He's taking part in the relief of Gibraltar and all sorts of things going on. And, well, he takes part in the third battle of Ushant. But realistically, the third battle of Ushant is less important for his career and his status than what happens next, because as successful as it was, as successful as the relief by Admiral Howe of Gibraltar was, which he takes part in a bit later, he manages to capture the Pegasus. And this is a picture of Fudrunt towing Pegasus into Portsmouth. He's captured a whole ship of line. And the capture of her, well, how do I put this politely? The third Battle of Ushant, the capture of Pegasus, is separate enough as an action that it's almost an independent credit. Fudrunt had managed to get ahead of the rest of the ships of force, even the frigates, close enough that she was actually able to spot the French convoy that led to the third Battle of Ushant. And she was able to spot they were being escorted by 274s, the Protector and the Pegasus, and frigates Indiscreet and Andromaque. There was turned out to be the Action Air, a 64-gun ship of the line, which was, how do I put this politely, armed en flute, which means had landed about half her guns. This was to enable her to move faster, but also carry troops. So she's a 64-gun third-rate ship of the line, theoretically, but realistically at this point, she's a 64-gun toting around 32 guns, and not really that valuable in a fight. Now, Fudrunt enters battle first. She gets in there quite quickly, and she manages to smash up onto Pegasus and engages her for 45 minutes, thereabouts. They boarded her, and they boarded her hard. It was a tough fight. It was not going to be an easy one, and they made sure. And her commander, the Chevalier de Science, was forced to surrender. She lost 100 killed and wounded of her roughly 700 crew. And there were only 3, if you count Jervis himself, were wounded in the battle. Jervis spends a lot of time playing it down. And basically not considering it a proper wound. He was wounded, but it was more of a case of, I was wounded, but I got the ship. And he's made a Knight of the Bar for this. Which is quite a nice thing. He's taken part in all sorts of operations, and he also, after this, gets to take part. And bringing this back, that's a lot of prize money coming in. He's never going to have to worry about being overdrawn at the bank again after this. It's after this he takes part in the Battle of Cape Spartel. And the Battle of Cape Spartel is a very indecisive battle, a very indecisive formation, which is unusual, I'd say, for Admiral Howe. Admiral Howe is usually a pretty decisive operator, but they have even number ships of the line. He has less killed and wounded after the battle, and honestly, he maintains the supply route to Gibraltar open, and that was the important strategic thing. But it was an indecisive battle. This time, Fudrunt wasn't in the 1st Division, or in the centre, with the Admiral. No. He was in the 2nd Division of the Van. So the Van was divided into 2 formations. Captain Hyde Park was at the front of the 1st Division of the Van, an HMS Goliath, and that division was under the command of Samuel Barrington, Vice Admiral, in charge of HMS Britannia. Fudrunt, with John Jervis, was the 2nd ship in the 2nd Division of the Van, which was commanded by Commodore William Hotham. And honestly, when you look down the list of officers at the Battle of Cape Spartel and what they will go on to achieve afterwards, and what they do achieve in their careers, you do wonder, to an extent, how it was such a passive battle. Especially when you consider it's a Franco-Spanish force underneath the command of the Spanish who they're fighting. It's an interesting scenario, but honestly, what happens is the Allied fleet, or rather, is sighted to east of Gibraltar. And Howe doesn't want to fight in the Straits. He doesn't consider it a good area to manoeuvre, so sails west. He's sailing west into the Atlantic. Once he's through the Straits and in a nice position, he reduces the fleet's sails. This is classic offering of battle. We are removing our speed. At this point, Cordova, who's in charge, signals general chase. Now, the British are in line of battle. And so, in general chase, you're not keeping to a line and you're advancing to engage, but you're going to come across them piecemeal. And this includes the Santissima Trinidad. The British reduced sail further. This was Howe's desire to tighten up the line. Why? Because honestly, I think he was planning to Roman their Gauls. They were going to be attacking, and the Gauls didn't always do this, but in some battles the Gauls lost control of their high command, and they would be attacking piecemeal. And basically, the idea I think Howe had was, we'd tighten up, and then as they come in 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, they're going to bash into the full fleet, and I'm going to annihilate them. The Allied fleet, the Franco-Spanish force, at this point realise they're in trouble. They realise that their fleet is too spread out and the British are too concentrated. And at 5:45 hours, when the Franco-Spanish fleet opens fire, the British not only return fire, but Howe has them retreat all sail a bit further. This means that of the Franco-Spanish fleet, now, because of the position they're in, 14 out of their 34 ships, can't get into a fight. But all of the British 34 can, and the 20 Franco-Spanish, I should be going because that makes more sense, but they're Spanish command, so I feel like I should be saying Spanish-Franco. Their ships basically can't do the operation. They are too strong. They're not in a position to fight it. And despite them having an advantage in terms of weight of fire and size of ships, which they do, they pretty much pull away. No British ships really get engaged properly, and the Spanish and French ships which are hit hard. The Gova makes repairs and tries to get action on the 21st of October, but they eventually found that Howe had sailed back to the UK in line with his orders and was just going, I don't need to fight you. It is the copper sheathing which is starting to come in at this point, which is really making a difference. But yeah, the battles are starting to build up. And there's a lot of British officers who want to be more aggressive and use these things more aggressively, but in Howe's case, he didn't see the need of it. And Jervis... Well, Jervis seems to have felt that the large fleet was rather unwieldy, and forming it into... well, honestly, 6 divisions as well as its 3 squadrons, but each squadron into a division, didn't really help it to his mind. He didn't really think it was necessarily the most helpful. It's the only option you have. It's the only option you have, really, to get these things to work, but he didn't really consider that helpful. Anyway, Shameless book plug. So, Shameless book plug. What is this one about? Well, I've got a couple of things coming. One, I'm still mooting what this year's writing competition again is going to be, and I'm going to save the video about last year's competition until I've worked out what this year's competition is going to be. And I thought I'd use this Shameless book plug as a bit of a chance for me to moot the idea in public and see what your reaction to it will be. What I'd really like people to do, and like to sort of task of being, would be take any admiral and staff from history and a battle, can be a famous one, can be not a famous battle, look at the events and stuff that is recorded about what they said and what decisions they made during the battle, and then turn it into, as I would call it, a complete narrative. Try and fill in the gaps, try and work out what their reasoning would be, and provide a sort of staff dialogue of what you think went on. Now, I realise this might sound strange, but it's a standard technique we do actually use quite a bit, is if we want to explain to often to students how bad decisions can be made in scenarios like this, you go, right, so this is your list of staff officers. You're having this discussion at this point when you're making this. Which staff officers are present? And I'll look at you and go, how do you know which staff officers are present? What information's being discussed? Where else could they be? What else could they be doing? Because that's the staff officers there, their respective responsibilities, what they're bringing is going to affect the information being discussed and viewed by the admiral at the time, by the person making decisions. And that's going to affect the decision making. And you might go, well, if they know this, so therefore they shouldn't be doing that. Well, do they know that? Is the person who knows that communicating that with the people making the decision? Has it been communicated to the staff officer? Is that staff officer in the room, or is that staff officer still not there when they're making a decision? And you do this as a sort of exercise, and you write it out, and you can then discuss it and compare it with others. And it's an interesting thing to do, but I'm not sure how to really set that, how to really approach that. So I'd be really interested in your ideas as to whether you like that idea, whether I should pick one battle and everyone should have to do the same one, or whether allowing people to do different battles would be a good idea. I really would like to get your feedback on that. And thank you to everyone who's supporting the channel. Liking, sharing, subscribing, all those things really do help the channel grow, really do help me reach more people. And it really wouldn't be possible without the support of patrons, without the support of members of the channel, without the super chats, super thanks, all those things. They really do allow me to keep the book stuff, especially, coming through. And this is coming from someone who's just spent rather a lot of money on ordering some books today, so I can do some more stuff as this year goes on. Basically, I try and buy the books I need for topics, if there are any extra books I need for topics, about 6 or so months in advance of me doing the topics, so I've got plenty of time to read them, become as familiar as I can with the books and understand them before we get into them. And so I've just placed the order for the top of the books I need for September, October, some of them today, and that was thanks to Patreon. That was able to be possible, and that's entirely thanks to you and all your support, so thank you. And there is going to be the Patreon vote starting soon, so suggestions, you've got a bit more time to put them in, but the Patreon vote is going to start tomorrow, so if you can get suggestions in by tomorrow that are currently on the one that's live, they could well be on the vote for the upcoming vote. Anyway, we've got the Battle of Martinique. Now, before we get to the Battle of Martinique, Jervis goes for a bit more career progression. He first gets to be a Commodore, gets to be hoisting his pennant on the 4-for-8 HMS Salisbury, 50 guns, decent sized vessel, and in December 1782 heads to the West Indies. But peace breaks out, and so he strikes his pennant in 1783. It's always annoying when that happens, but it does provide him the opportunity to come and marry his cousin, Martha. He does. She's the daughter of the very interestingly titled Lord Chief Baron Sir Thomas Parker, which is an old title in the list of exchequer roles, and I don't need to get into that much of that. But he also, Jervis, goes to become an MP, coming for Launceston in 1783, and later on in 1784, standing for Great Yarmouth. He votes for and against Pitt depending on his mood. He quite likes Pitt in some ways, but he tends to support him in his leadership, but doesn't always agree with his bills and will sometimes vote against them. In 1787, he becomes a Rear Admiral of the Blue, the lowest of the Rear Admiral ranks, but a good rank to be at this point, because if we consider he's only 52 years old and has only been a captain for 27 years. Only been a captain for 27 years. I mean, it's a great rate of promotion at this point. It really is. But it's also a fact that quite a lot of naval officers tend to be quite long-lived. And what usually happens is in periods of war, they promote a lot of admirals, so you end up with lots of Rear Admirals of Blue, Rear Admirals of red, white and red, and etc., and various Vice Admirals, etc. And then in peacetime, they go, we don't need all these admirals, so they just stop the promotions. They just run it down a bit. And then war comes along and they boost it up again. It's the way, it's the cycle of the things. It's almost a boom and bust process. And this keeps on. He keeps hoisting his flag. He's doing various duties, various deterrence operations. He's sent to sit in off the coast of the Netherlands for a while to try and deter a Prussian invasion. The Prussian invasion getting worse in the Netherlands. He takes part in the Casown crisis. Eventually, in 1790, he is made a Rear Admiral of the White, and, well, then he stands down as MP for Great Yarmouth and becomes an MP for Chipping Wickham instead. A nice spot to be returned to. He really doesn't talk much in the House of Commons, though, other than about naval matters. And if you look up what he said in Parliament, he really does focus on naval matters. He might not be technically an Admiralty MP because he's not standing for their spots, but by God is he a naval MP. And he will almost always vote with the Navy, although he will be critical of them if he doesn't think they're asking for enough, or if he thinks the exigencies of the office are not being served. Remember, he's about efficiency, sometimes not effectiveness, and the Navy Board especially gets a lot of critique from him. In 1794, well, he resigns his seat and doesn't stand for political office again. Just goes, no, I've had enough time. So he's been an MP on and off for 11 years. He's done his time, he feels. And it's also about this time that he's made Vice Admiral of the Blue and is appointed Commander-in-Chief of the Leeward Islands. Which is a nice position to be given. Again, it's a good spot. It's a good spot for any war, especially. It's a good spot in the Caribbean. And with that, he, in the great tradition of the Royal Navy, is given an amphibious operation to run, because, of course, this is what you do. This is what you do. You run an amphibious operation. That's how you test and train out commanders. You send them out on amphibious operation. They do one good thing. They give him Sir Charles Grey, who was a friend, a political ally, but also a very good army officer. And so, when he hoists his flag in the second-rate HMS Boyne, he takes George Grey, who's Sir Charles Grey's son, as his flag captain. Really cementing a relationship, and they go off to capture Martinique, Guadeloupe, and St. Lucia. Now, this is pretty much pro forma. I've already discussed this before. In terms of standard protocol for the British when they're at war with the French, take out their colonies, and then Treaty of Amiens or something will give them back. And in the case of Guadeloupe, they take it. And then the French managed to take it back because, honestly, the garrison left there wasn't strong enough. Tropical diseases had really wrecked the British forces that were there, and you've taken it and then you lose it. But the problem is, with all these battles, etc., there is a great dispute that comes up after them. You see, should have been a huge amount of prize money paid out to the officers and dividends, but despite there being, how do I put this? The officers were both seen as sufficiently of a political faction, after all, Jervis was a former MP, that honestly there was objection to it. There was fight against it. And they actually, in the end, didn't give them the peerages. They ended up having to give them the shares of the prize money, but they didn't give them the usual awards for service. And eventually, when there's a vote of censure against them, it's negative, it fails. They do, however, get the thanks of both services, from Parliament for both services eventually. And Jervis is appointed a Vice Admiral the White after it. But it's honestly, again, something which sours Jervis on politics. Because he'd done this job, he'd done this service. Surely he should be given some respect. Well, you can maybe judge the respect of his peers, because he next gets command of the Mediterranean Fleet. And he's not only promoted to Vice Admiral of the White in April 1794, by June 1795 he's made to an Admiral of the Blue. Now please note, he has skipped Vice Admiral of the Red, he has skipped Rear Admiral of the Red in going up those ranks. This is not unusual. He's promoted. If you're just talking peacetime and there's nothing going on, you're promoted up, you will literally go Rear Admiral Blue, White, Red. Vice Admiral Blue, White, Red. Admiral Blue, White. Traditionally, prior to a certain date, it goes straight to Admiral of the Fleet. But at a certain point, they do add in the red, so you get Admiral of the Red. And that's the peacetime progression. Wartime, and the vast majority of officers, because believe it or not, war happens a lot in this period, in the 18th century and early 19th century. War is going on a lot. There's a reason it's called the Second 100 Years' War. Usually, officers go, maybe they do a normal progression, and then they'll do a jump. They'll do a victory, or they'll do something. And so they'll jump one. And you'll sometimes have officers who will literally hop up Rear Admiral, Vice Admiral, Full Admiral, and only ever do one flag on each one. One colour on each one. On each level. And please do note, again, I'm going to say this again, but I'm going to see this in probably every Age of Sail video about the Royal Navy. There are some who truly believe that if you're a Rear Admiral of the Red, you can give an order to a Full Admiral of the White or an Admiral of the Blue. You can't. Okay? Their ranks are Rear Admiral, Vice Admiral, Full Admiral, and it comes from, the colours are from the squadrons. So, the white was the van, the blue was the rear, and the red was the centre. Okay? So that's why that was traditionally the Admiral of the Fleet, because that was usually the Admiral who was in charge of the whole fleet, who would be in charge. And pretty much, Rear Admirals are the Rear Admirals of their squadrons. That's where it comes from. Then there's the Vice Admiral, who's the second in command of the squadron, and then there's the Full Admiral of the squadron. Rear Admiral of the rear cannot tell the Vice Admiral of the front what to do, and vice versa. It just doesn't work. So the Rear Admirals are a rank. You could almost argue that the colours are according to their grade within that rank. So if you're a Vice Admiral, you're a Vice Admiral. No Rear Admiral's giving you orders. If you're an Admiral, you're an Admiral. No one else is giving you orders. But what matters is, if you've got two Admirals together, and one's an Admiral of the White, and one's an Admiral of the Blue, the Admiral of the White is in charge. They hold the senior commission. So you almost have to consider it, it's kind of like, instead of you having 1 stars, 2 stars, or 3 stars, or, because Commodore is a broad pennant position, not an actual fixed position, 2 stars, 3 stars, and 4 stars, you almost have to consider it's a 2.1 star, 2.2 star, or 2.3 star, and then 3.1, 3.2, 3.3, etc. And what matters is your substantive rank is Vice Admiral. Only matters when you're dealing with other Vice Admirals what colour flag you are. And then if you're both vice admirals of the same colour, then they have to work out which year, when was your actual promotion. And even that might not always come to pass, because if you are in charge of the senior squadron, i.e. you're a vice admiral in charge of the Mediterranean fleet, whereas you're a vice admiral just in charge of that squadron, just commissioned for that squadron, oh, all sorts of hilarity can arise. It's beautiful. But no, he gets the Mediterranean fleet. He loses his flagship, the Boyne, because she catches fire in May 1795 and blows up at Spithead. And he'd lost all his possessions aboard his ship. So he goes out to the Mediterranean fleet, and he once more takes George Grey, Charles Grey's son, as his flag captain. And he took Robert Calder as what he would call the captain of his fleet. So basically his chief of staff. And when he arrives, he takes over HMS Victory as his flagship. In Mediterranean fleet, he finds people like Nelson, Cuthbert Collingwood, and Thomas Troutbridge. And these are just some of the officers he will have the pleasure of commanding. He really does find a really good band of officers who quite a lot of them come from his Total War faction. And by Total War, I mean they believe in all-out complete warfare. At this point, he starts doing his operations off Toulon. He's watching for the various positions of admirals, what Nelson's off doing, what Mann is off doing. He has subordinates going all over the place in the Mediterranean doing various duties. But at a certain point, you have the Battle of Cape St Vincent. And the Battle of Cape St Vincent is between the Spain and the British. That's the thing, it's a Spanish fleet, not a French fleet. It's the Dons. And it's a good quality fleet. The Spanish really do send a hard fighting force. Now, setting the tone for St Vincent, prior to this battle, Jervis had been forced to withdraw quite a lot. The Spanish force of 25 ships line, combined with the French force of 13, 14 ships line, had been overwhelming in its might. And been forced to withdraw. He couldn't face 38 ships at a line with 15. And so they had to evacuate, basically. They had to withdraw from positions in Corsica and other places to be able to get themselves into a decent position and to give themselves a chance. And as they'd withdrawn, well, opportunities had happened, because the Franco-Spanish forces started to split up. Started to not work together as often. And there comes a point where they're covering convoys and the Spanish are alone. And they're spotted by Nelson to be alone. He managed to go through them in fog while he's aboard Minerva, a frigate. And Jervis sails towards them. He doesn't know how many there are. He sails towards them. And there's this fun little phrasing which is has appeared in so many different documents over the years. We're not quite sure, but Calder, who was his fleet captain, is quite a good pair of eyes. And as they are heading towards the Spanish ships, which turns out to be 24, 25 in strength, in terms of officially they were supposed to be 25. But I think the actual battle is only roughly 24 actually get into and engage. As they're heading towards them, and this is pure Jervis in terms of what happens, Calder is asked to start calling out how many they're seeing. It starts off with, "There are 8 sail the line, Sir John." "Very well, sir." "There are 20 sail the line, Sir John." "Very well, sir." "There are 25 sail lines, Sir John." "Very well, sir." There are 27 sail the line, Sir John. Enough, sir! No more of that! The die is cast, and if there are 50 sail, I will go through them! Sorry, Raleigh. You can just hear the tension. Even in the written word, you can hear the tension of, yes, this is an admiral who has made his decision. And it is a very interesting battle from that guard, because there are 15 ships of the line versus 25 ships of the line. And this is probably not Trafalgar. The Battle of Cape St Vincent is where the idea really starts to get hold, but the Royal Navy should fight the enemy whenever, wherever, and will fight the enemy whenever, wherever, however. When they're engaging a battle where they outnumbered 3-2, plus the enemy has frigates, brigs, all sorts of support, and armed merchant vessels as well, which look like 4 freights, which is one of the reasons why they're counting so many and thinking there's so many ships on the line there. And this turns into a battle whereby the British will not only escape relatively unharmed, 73 dead, 227 wounded, that's very, very minimal losses, but they will capture 4 enemy ships of the line. The Spanish will suffer overwhelming losses, and even more so, they will lose some very senior officers and some very big and powerful ships in this battle. And, in many ways, that comes down to Jervis's indomitable spirit, doesn't it? Sorry. Fluffy Poodle decided he needed attention after that. Did the Jervis acting scare you a bit? I do apologise. You deserve biscuits for this? Biscuits it is. Okay. Poodles. Poodles. I don't know. Poodles. There you go. You knocked my mouse out of the way, so I can't skip slides. Now, how was this great victory achieved? Well, pretty much the British were able to keep themselves concentrated, and the Spanish were divided into 2 groups. Roughly 18 ships to one side, 9 ships to the other side, but it was far more of the warships were concentrated in the 9. They were all warships, whereas some of the 18 were some of those large merchant vessels. And despite the Spanish making a couple attempts to break the British line, they managed to be held off, including when victory proved too fast for the Principe de Asturias and managed to give 2 raking broadsides to the Asturias when she tried to break the British line. But this is where Jervis is helped out by Nelson, because Nelson's aboard HMS Captain, his 74-gun ship, and he's towards the rear of the British line. And when he sees that Jervis is doing a maneuver which cannot be completed in time before the Spanish could escape, he managed to wear his ship instead of following the maneuver, and managed to block off the smaller group. And he actually passes between his own British line, between Diadem and Excellent, and runs across the bows of the Spanish ships, which include the San Isidro Trinidad, the San Jose, the Salvador del Mundo, the San Nicolas, and the Mexicano, and the San Isidoro. And he was acting against the rules, which were form line, a head and stern victory. But you have to remember, there is also in the signal which went out was take suitable stations, forming line and stern and ahead of victory, and he's using the taking suitable stations to its fullest extent. Now the thing is, if he'd failed, there is no doubt with Vincent that Earl St Vincent, aka Jervis, he would have been absolutely disgraced and kicked out. But he succeeded. And St Vincent had become but Jervis before this battle, and during this battle, really likes winning. Winning is the higher prize, and to his view, Nelson was acting in full total war mode. Now, at this point, Collingwood also starts manoeuvring his ships and starts putting them into the right position. And eventually, the British are blocking both the Spanish managing to draw their forces back together, the larger force managing to get back with the smaller force to combine together, and also managing to engage the smaller force. The Captain herself is now fighting roughly 6 vessels, 3 of which were 112 gun first rates. And Cordoba's own 130 gun Santa Trinidad is one of them, and Cordoba is the guy in charge of the Spanish force. So, you know, it's quite a heavy force that's there fighting away. And this is not a good position for Captain to be in. She's a doughty 74, yes, but this is not a good position she should be in. But the Excellent and other vessels of the force are starting to wear up on them as well. Basically, Vincent notices what's going on and goes, "That's working. All right, I'll do that. I will do that. I will go and help and support that." And so that's what they did. The battle turns into an absolutely nuts affair, and there is always the famous thing of Nelson's painted boarding methodology, boarding from using one ship, because he managed to capture one Spanish ship, and then another Spanish ship runs into the back of it, and he uses that Spanish ship, which he's already captured, to board a second Spanish ship, and it's called Nelson's painted boarding bridge. And all sorts of fun things happen. It's a mess of a battle. But it would have happened if, A, Jervis hadn't been driving his fleet mad with gunnery practice and really drilling their scaling skills and holding to an impossible high standard. You have to admit that on this one. And B, if he hadn't managed to convince every single captain that anything less than their full-throated active support was not going to be good for their life expectancy. And that's the important thing. This is one of those battles where there are no hesitations. There's no captain ships holding back. Every captain in that fleet knows that if you hold back and this battle goes anything less than and they don't win, or even if you hold back and they do win, after the battle you're going to have a conversation with Jervis. And the whole phrase of ripping you a new one, that'll be nice compared to whatever Jervis does to you. What Jervis will do to you will probably make what Admiral Duncan, as a contemporary, did to his mutineers look like a friendly gesture. No one at this point had, I think, flogged a captain round the fleet, but I'm sure Jervis would be interested in trying it. That is, by the way, where you row someone round the fleet, flogging them in front of the fleet to basically setting an example. Yeah, Jervis had so many ideas, so many ideas of what suitable punishments were. But yeah, the Battle of Cape St Vincent. In its aftermath, the Spanish are just in shock. They're going, "What the frigate? How did this happen? How did this happen?" But for the Royal Navy, this was the glorious victory which would set them on the path. Far more than any other victory, even Trafalgar. The Battle of Cape St Vincent, and I've got to do a whole video about it someday, I don't think I've done one yet on my channel, is a mess of heroism and of some brilliant manoeuvring by sub-commanders and by individual commanders, who are exercising the full latitude of their command, knowing that if they fail, they will get royally roasted. But if they succeed, well, that's the one good thing about Jervis. If you succeed, and if you're therefore one of the people he supports, if you have succeeded in impressing him, no one's going to touch you. No one is. Because Jervis will touch them. And not in a way they enjoy. He will, quite literally, tongue-lashed them, at least to death, if not anything else. After this victory, he gets withdrawn to the Channel Fleet. He now gets to command the Channel. And that's a pretty cool thing in your career. That's also going to be pretty much the largest force he's able to do. He's the largest force he's ever able to command, because that's usually the largest squadron in the Royal Navy, the Channel Squadron. Now, this is the point where it's worthwhile to start considering his actual, not just his leadership in terms of the Mediterranean Squadron, but the reputation he's bringing with him. This is a man who, when he had sentenced some sailors to be hung on a Saturday, he hung them on a Sunday, and when Admiral Charles Thompson objected, because he didn't feel there should be objections on the Sabbath, basically wrote to the Board of Admiralty and said they either fire Thompson or him. They fired Thompson. This is the man who had, conversely on the other side, when he'd found out that the post office in Lisbon had been, the postmaster in Lisbon had been, not just the post office, but the postmaster on their own cognizance, had decided to detain the letters and packets arriving from England in case they had carried seditious communications, because there were mutinies going on in the fleet at the time. Jervis considered that a complete infringement of the Articles of War, and set up a post office aboard his own flagship, the Ville de Paris, to receive and distribute all these letters, so that they would be sorted out. He did separate the Marines where possible from the sailors. He had them kept separate in terms of where they would mess between the officers and the men, and he had them armed at all times as well, as there are mutinies going on in the wider navy. He also tried to keep ships separate, but on the other side, when tobacco was running low in the fleet, he renewed it out of his own funds to ensure there was enough tobacco for the men. This is the thing about Jervis, and to an extent, one of the reasons why it works. And I think possibly why it works for him leadership and why it doesn't work for most of the leadership scenarios. Because whilst he is an absolute ginormous, and I will say this politely as I can, ginormous sod to work for, in that he is quite so, this is perfection, you have to achieve perfection or I am not happy and I'm going to be angry with you. He demands perfection of himself, and that means he will treat you evenly. He might have favourites, but those favourites don't get any special treatment. There's a midshipman he actually was loosely impressed by, but that midshipman decided to go against orders and actually encourage his men to attack a fishing boat and to steal its products. And this shows you what example he's holding this to, because he's applied to officers as well as men. The boat's crew get minimal really punishment, because it's the officer who ordered it. And this midshipman is degraded from the rank of midshipman by having his uniform stripped from his back on the quarterdeck of his ship before the whole company. It's the most disgraceful manner possible. He then is fined for all pay due to him for his services aboard any ship. All pay and all prize money, everything. Furthermore, his work at that point is going to be at the personal behest of Jervis and what he instructs, and he is banned from ever becoming a petty officer or an officer in any of His Majesty's ships in the future. That midshipman also had his head shaved, a notice hung around his neck to tell everyone what his crimes were, and he was made solely and personally responsible for cleaning of the heads, which is naval slang for the lavatories, situated at the bow of the ship, until further notice. That's Jervis for you. This is a man who has absolute and total assurity that he is in charge, But you are going to have to hold up to his standards. And his standards include you do not rob a fishing boat. You don't do anything which he does not consider within the Articles of War, and he has not given you permission for or license to. Nelson can get away with things. He brought him victory. You, robbing a fishing boat, are bringing him disgrace. You won't get away with anything. Now, there's also scenarios like when a sailor who doesn't understand that the banknotes he has are waterproof and jumps in to bathe with his money in his pocket. He starts crying. The Admiral sees this, asks the problem. Well, he finds out what the issue is, and this is recorded quite a lot. It's called The Story of Roger O'Dell. And basically, St Vincent gives him £70 of his own money so he's not out of pocket. Yes, he was allowed to bathe. Yes, he went bathing with the money in his own pocket, and he'd never do that again. But the Earl gives him £70 to make up for his losses, and that's a lot of money. In 1797, that is a lot of money. So eventually he has to go home for his bad health, but he gets better quite quickly, and this a couple of years later. And he's given command of the Channel Fleet. And when he's given command of the Channel Fleet, he is literally being given it, he knows, because of the ill discipline and issues running in the Channel Fleet at this point. They hadn't had action. The Mediterranean Fleet had been having action. The Channel Fleet were mostly doing blockade duty. And blockade duty, like garrison duty or prison guard duty, can erode morale like anything if you don't have someone really doing their best to keep things motivated. And St Vincent will do that. Pretty much as soon as he gets put in charge of the Channel Fleet, he issues orders which ban officers and captains from sleeping ashore when their ships are in harbour, and also forbade them from travelling more than 3 miles from their ship. Unsurprisingly, it's known that he wasn't very popular with some members of the Channel Fleet, and things got stricter before they got better, as far as the Channel Fleet were concerned, because he was really going to make them into a fighting force. He truly believed that's what he'd been called. You know, when he's told he's been appointed, and his health is still not great, he says the king and the government require it, and the discipline of the British Navy demands it. It is of no consequence to me whether I die afloat or ashore. The die is cast. That is pure Jervis, pure St Vincent. And, well, the thing is, while he's in charge of them, while he's supporting them doing the operations, he can't earn their respect, as he always does. Yes, he holds them to an impossible standards. Yes, his punishments when they break the rules do border on cruel, vindictive, and unseemly. But by golly, does he hold himself to the same standards he holds them to. So, to an extent, they start to respect him. And to give you an example of how he does this in the Channel Squadron, well, how do I put this? There is an incident with Sir Edward Pellew, who's captain at this point of Imperieuse, and he is trying to give chase to a French vessel. The admiral, the rear admiral in charge of the inshore squadron, recalls him because he's worried it will run aground. So this leads to letters, because St Vincent's view is, well, as long as Pellew thought it was fine, if Pellew could give chase. You harry the French. You harry them. You don't give them a chance. The letters go back and forward. Eventually, St Vincent gets tired of this rear admiral's actions, and so Vincent takes his flagship, the entire offshore squadron, and sails between them and the inshore squadron and the shore. So basically, he takes, personally leading, the heavy ships, which are supposed to keep further away. The inshore squadron are, when you do a blockade, You don't want to catch your ships near the shore because they can get damaged. So you usually have a smaller group of ships near the shore to watch the harbour, and the fleet sits over the horizon, safer in storms and safer from all these things. What he does is he takes that entire large fleet, takes them inside of the inside squadron, and sails happily there, proving that the ships were shallow enough to give chase and capture the French. After doing this, St Vincent has publicly humiliated this rear admiral. He then writes and suggests that the man strike his flag and return to shore for some much needed rest. The rear admiral gets the point and goes home quickly. But conversely, you can also have things where letters arrive from England, and the Admiral received a letter from an orphanage. Vincent received near Paddington, which he knew about and knew well. And they said they'd run out of money. And that was an orphanage set up to support the children of sailors who died in service of the country. And one of the reasons he kept in contact with them was they had some of the children of ships which, sailors who died under his command. And so he'd been keeping a personal track of them. So he invites the richest captain and lieutenants he knows from the fleet and invites them to dinner on his ship. It's a full fundraising dinner. And he reads them the letter and then says, well, I'm going to put in this much money. The cutter that brought the letter sails back to England the nightly post. They take back £1,000. Think of that, £1,000 arriving. Charity really does begin at home, doesn't it? The charities today would love St Vincent. He's on your side, yes, he is that intimidating. He will get £1,000 in today's money. Roughly 100,000 in today's money was raised in one evening. And it didn't stop there. He made sure they were properly funded, because he also sent a letter to the Admiralty about it. And notes that these officers had provided this much money. And the Admiralty immediately went, frigate. The money was matched, I think, from the stories I've read by the Admiralty. And so, roughly they got £200,000, which is not going to support them forever. But from that point onwards, the orphanage was being closely watched by the Admiralty and would always receive funding when necessary. They made sure appropriate fundraising was being done. No one wanted St Vincent to turn up on their doorstep. No one wanted St Vincent to turn up on their doorstep. He was also one of the early converts to the scurvy situation and needing fresh vegetables and lemon juice, and also have to have a hospital ship with the fleet. Although, by a certain point, it was deemed as unneeded, and it was eventually sent home. By November 1800, when the fleet came into Torbay, there were only 16 hospital cases out of 23,000 men. When usually, scurvy cases, when they come ashore, they'd have 1,000 to 2,000 plus dead. This was important. And this is when St Vincent becomes a big fan and a big proponent of Dr. Baird as being the most valuable man in Navy, not accepting the board itself. Well, that's what he writes to Evan Nepean, the Secretary of the Admiralty. Although that's not his most famous letter. His most famous letter to the Admiralty comes from 1801, when he writes, I do not say, my lords, that the French will not come. I say they will not come by sea. This is because everyone's worried in 1801 about a French invasion for a scare. St Vincent's going, I wish they could come. I've got a nice big fleet now. I've been in charge of this fleet for now 2 years. It's fighting efficiency. Let me at them! But he doesn't get it. And he's replaced by Admiral Cornwallis and promoted to First Lord of the Admiralty later that same year. And this is when you have real trouble, because Jervis, Lord love him, he's a fighting admiral. He is a good administrator of fleet. He's a great logistician. He's managed to sort all these things out. But, oh Lord, you should not be letting him in charge of a naval administration. You really shouldn't, because he starts from a position that the Navy Board and the dockyards are not only corrupt, but they are full of enormous evils. And nothing can be attempted till we have nothing. Whilst they can't sweep it till they have peace, once they have peace, you must sweep it of all the corruption, everything. And as I've explained before, when dealing with these systems, there is a certain level of corruption in this period, and there's actually a certain level of corruption which works for you. That sounds scary in this period, but let's consider it. Okay. Patronage is how the Navy works, but also how the civilian society works. Let's say you have a major lord, a very senior noble, and they are pushing a certain builder to build something for your yard. You don't know if that's actually going to work, so you basically get the builder to build something for you at your estate, let's say. And then, when they're building in the yard, you can compare their work to what they built at your estate. And if it's not the same, then you can hold them up as fraudulent, and then you can stop the work and hold them to account without besmirching the massive, powerful lord who promotes them in the first place. Because if you just say no, or just on the first thing when they're doing work, just to say this is not done properly, you run the risk of ending up in a fight with that powerful lord, which can cause you trouble for other reasons. So you have to be careful. So there's a certain level of corruption going on here, which actually works in the favour of the Navy. The corruption which doesn't work is when the people doing prosing are the naval commissioners themselves, and they're not having someone do any work themselves, so they've not got anything to check it to, and they're just proposing and taking a kickback. That doesn't work. So you always have to be careful. This is one of those periods where it really, there's a little bit of, there's a sort of certain level of corruption which actually works for you. But that's because of the system and society you're in. Okay? Not because corruption is ever really a good thing, but because it's how you work in the system and society. Now, the thing is, they do actually discover a lot of issues which they do start to put right. But it does cause huge problems for the Navy and its supply chain. Now, there were things which did need to be put right, and this is not true. And honestly, I think it's a laudable thing to have done the investigating in the first place. But the trouble is, in some regards, St Vincent's going in and acting as if they're his fleet at sea rather than a civilian administration. And he's always sure there's more corruption. No matter what he finds, he's always sure there's more. They do excellent reports, though, and those reports do help improve the Navy for the next century. It is those reports which start the basis of the next century and do start off making the Navy stronger. And there were, and please note, there were some problems. But some of the things they found were things like men were listed to have done work, then overtime, acted as night watchmen, and all the things non-stop for years without taking any days off. And that's theoretically impossible. But also, when you consider the low wages they were paying, that was also how some of them could actually afford to live. And this was the main thing which Jervis found, that the corruption, in terms of things, were taking place of properly paying the men, properly accounting the men. Especially when he found that sometimes the reason why the men were earning such low wages was because dockyard officers were taking commissions from them. He also found an entire department in one dockyard which was full of incapables, old, infirm boys, cripples, idiots, and it was more of an asylum than an actual department within a dockyard. But again, he realizes very quickly that that was the dockyard's answer to the problem of what do we do with these people who we can't get rid of? And we have to take care of them because they're part of the wider dockyard family, like the orphanage he looked after. And so he wants to sort out a situation for them, but he doesn't want them to be being paid for by the Navy, and he wants all the things to be running properly. Now, he does achieve the introduction of block-making machinery, which is designed to improve things, and that does really help. You know, they're sort of by 1808, these machines are turning out 130,000 pulley blocks per year. That's important. Why? Because that means you're paying between what's felt to be 10 to 30 men to run those machines, rather than probably closer to 200 skilled block makers who had been hand carving blocks prior to it. And that enables the Navy to grow, enables the Navy to be far bigger, far more powerful, along with the rope making walks, etc. These and the block works, these things allow the Royal Navy to be really sufficient in operating ships, and almost to scale as big as they need to. They have the infrastructure to support. They can put the sails, they can put the rigging on as many ships as they need to put them, because they produce so much. They're actually selling some of the excess. Usually to British merchant ships, but they're selling some of the excess. And this helps. Now, he also has fun dealing with the typical business of First Lords of the Admiralty. Promotions. Who's he going to promote? And he certainly seems to have an interesting policy. It depends on the officer they're talking about, but also depends on who's writing and how he's going to act. Because, well, this is what he writes to the Earl of Portsmouth. And it's a good one. Again, there are various books of his letters, so you can go and enjoy them. I cannot possibly agree in opinion with your lordship that a person sitting quietly by his fireside and enjoying very nearly a sinecure during such a war as we have been engaged in has the same pretensions to promotion with the man who has exposed his person and hazarded his constitution every clime. Yet, to a nice lady who seems to have had nothing of status but just been a lady, although I cannot admit the force of your argument in favour of Captain Unknown, there is something so amiable and laudable in a sister contending for the promotion of a brother that no apology is necessary for your letter of the 24th, which I lose no time in acknowledging. By the way, guess which officer actually gets a promotion. One was a sister writing about her brother who was a captain who hadn't got a ship at that time, and it was peace, so there weren't enough ships going around. But a guardship would be found. One was an earl, a peer of the realm, someone who would expect St Vincent, an earl, to listen to him. And St Vincent has basically crushed one and promoted the other. Now, this is not unusual, but what is unusual was quite how forceful he was getting in it. He was very strict that he was going to be promoting things on beneficial reasons. For the Navy. Beneficial for the Navy. The best quality. Now, this might seem sensible, and it is certainly very sensible in terms of the quality of the Navy. What it does cause is quite a lot of political outrage and a lot of political problems. And when you're also reforming the yards and questioning people under oath, although they're not, so that they don't have to incriminate themselves, they can choose not to answer. St Vincent does operate on a policy: if you refuse to answer, you've incriminated yourself and you're gone. If he has a chance. Now that leads to a whole interesting interaction, though, as time goes on with Cochrane, because Lord Cochrane captures a ship, the Algama, which becomes the HMS Seedy. Unfortunately, the vessel he sent with the letter letter talking about the victory, normally be promoted from commander to captain, for that victory, that letter was intercepted. It was intercepted. And so news of the victory only came after Cochrane had actually been captured by the French. And when you lose your ship, you automatically have a court-martial. Can't think why. And because you're under court-martial, you can't be promoted until you're cleared. Those are the rules. However, Cochrane, being Cochrane, and having a small ego problem, and Jervis being Jervis, and having quite a fine temper problem, meant that this became a bit of a dispute between the two, because Cochrane thought that the First Lord had deliberately snubbed him. He snubbed me. I don't know why he has a grudge against me. I've never spent much time with him before, but he must have a grudge against me to snub at me like this, and I will hate him for the rest of my life. And complains to his friends loudly and longly about it. These powerful friends start causing Jervis trouble, which means Jervis, who didn't have a grudge against him beforehand, soon develops one. For annoying him. With all this going on, and eventually impeaching Henry Dundas, who was the first Viscount Melville and probably one of the most powerful politicians in Scotland at the time, and certainly a very good friend of William Pitt, for misappropriation of public funds, well, he's caused a lot of trouble. He ends up going when there's a change in government, unsurprisingly, when Pitt manages to replace Addington. He's gone. And when people try and turn around and start charging him with neglect, though, they're very quickly shut down. No one's prepared to charge him with neglect. No one's prepared to charge him with doing work. He has disrupted a massive amount of work. And doing all these reforms, etc., have caused huge delays in shipbuilding. And because you had the projected programs, and then suddenly the people who were involved in it might not have been doing much work, but they were doing something, were now off defending themselves or being replaced. It's one of the things of why St Vincent believed you couldn't do that in wartime, but you had to do it in peacetime. Anyway, how's he rewarded? Well, he's returned to the Channel Fleet. He gets the Hibernia, a ship which had actually been built while he's First Lord of the Admiralty. So some ship construction had definitely been going on, and had been going along successfully. He's promoted to an Admiral the Red. It's come in now. It's one of the most senior rank of Admiral you can be. So he's an Admiral. So he's a 4.3 star. To use our earlier discussion. And he's in charge of the Channel Fleet. Once again, his orders prove unpopular when they're implemented because they are making everything tight, but he does quite well. He does go off and do some other missions as well for the government. Pitt does seem to trust him with other missions, including sending him to Portugal to, if necessary, evacuate the Portuguese court to Brazil. And he arranges the things which eventually Sir Sidney Smith and Graham Moore execute to evacuate the Portuguese royal family to Brazil. But, yeah. The Earl is back in the Channel Fleet, and the Channel Fleet is reliable. He retires in 1807, and he's given audience with the King. The King asks him a question. Is the Navy a better institution now than it had been when St Vincent joined it? St Vincent replied, it was not. His main contention being that the younger branches of the nobility were taking over the Navy and choking up the patronage, along with MPs. He'd also written at various points that he felt that no one below the rank of Rear Admiral should be allowed to be an MP for the Royal Navy. He didn't like it when young officers who were captains or commanders even would use their position in the House of Commons to be rude about their admirals. He felt it was not good for good discipline. Which is probably right. It wasn't. He never had any children, and so his title passes to his, I think it's to his nephew. He's alone when his wife dies in 1816. Martha had been a good wife for him, and had been one of the few people who could really hold him to account, and who could really get him to change his mood. He was a professional to the core. He was certainly a hard-working admiral. And in summary, I don't know. A man who's going to be that rigid, that strong in terms of rules and regulations, who's always going to see the crime, not the individual. Yeah, that can be hard to work with. But also there's the fact that whilst all these complaints come about, when you look at the force as a whole that work for him, they reach a level of efficiency and capability which they do not achieve under almost anyone else. And that is something. And that is certainly something. He's showered with honours. He raised a generation of naval officers after him. He pushed for victory. He pushed for hard work. But in more than anything else, he was a standards man. He was about creating a navy, and it's interesting to read his notes about the naval service and choking up the path of patronage and promotion when you consider what the navy ends up having to deal with in the time of Admiral Fisher. That is when you have the various reforms which make it possible now for an admiral from someone of the standing of Nelson to actually still serve as an officer in the Royal Navy. Yeah. So Fisher is dealing with the tail end of what Jervis was talking about 100 years earlier, almost. Yeah. So, what is today's question going to be? Well, he was a taskmaster and a half. He really was a taskmaster and a half. He demanded nothing of anyone that he wouldn't do himself, and he held everyone to a very high standard, but he held himself to such a high standard as well. So you can understand that. But I'd like you to think about his leadership style. That all or nothing leadership style. That going everything in, on all in. Do you think it would work in modern warfare? Do you think demanding such high standards is possible in the modern world? And why do you think it works so well for him? Because none of the writings I read for him suggest he was charismatic. And looking at the pictures of him, well, I don't know. There is something about him which does look like he has a nice he has a nice person, but that could be the artistic interpretation. Considering what some of the stuff I read about him, and have read of his own writings and his own words and what he said, I don't think he was necessarily cut out for politics, because he really wasn't cut out for compromise. But I'm interested to see your answers to questions below. What have we got coming up? Well, next week's the 11th, and that one's a surprise. But it should be coming out, it should be recorded soon. Take care and have fun.